In August 2018, I was invited to give 2 talks commemorating the 78th anniversary of the 1940 flood, one to the Boone Area Chamber of Commerce and the other here at BRAHM. While each talk had a slightly different frame, the core of both presentations focused on lessons that we still hadn't learned from Watauga County's long history of catastrophic flooding over the preceding century. I highlighted the increasing frequency with which severe flooding events were occurring in Boone and the reasons why. I wrapped those talks by strongly cautioning that an event on the scale of the 1940 flood, or worse, would likely occur in the relative near term, and that the impact would be devastating for our community and our local economy. I urged our local governments and our communities to begin to take urgent action to prepare for what was coming. Those talks received mixed reviews. Some folks appreciated the walk through our local history of flooding and the context for why we should be even more on guard in the 21st century. Others were pretty harsh in their criticisms. One person here at BRAHM, not at BRAHM, but an attendee here at the BRAHM talk, asked if I'm a hydrologist. I'm not. Then rather pointedly concluded that since I'm neither a hydrologist nor a meteorologist, I didn't know what I was talking about. Some folks thought I was being overly dramatic and fear-mongering. A few folks questioned what historians actually know about the weather and why they bother to talk about it publicly. You should stick to your day job, one person even told me after one of those talks. But those who know me well also know that I've spent a lifetime and several careers cautioning about foreseeable but often unexpected outcomes, and like the mythological Cassandra, I'm used to uttering warnings that are not easily accepted or believed. Fast forward 6 years. At 5:33 on Thursday, September 26, 2024, I shared this post from the National Weather Service's Weather Prediction Center on my private Facebook page and cautioned that our rain total for the next 3 days, Wednesday through Friday, would likely exceed the 1940 flood totals. For context, 10 to 14 inches of rain fell on Watauga County in 1940. The same day I posted this, predictions for Boone from local and national meteorologists were slightly more optimistic. National Weather Service wasn't yet predicting the 20.1 inches we would actually receive in Boone over those 3 days. They were still thinking 8 to 10. Ray Russell's last website update for the day called for several more inches of rain with double-digit rainfalls common in much of the mountains, particularly along the Blue Ridge, and favored east/southeast facing slopes. At that point, there had been 3 to 4 inches in Boone, with Ray's chart predicting another 6 to 7 inches. So in total, he was forecasting about 11 inches combined at most in town. Ray also warned that there would be catastrophic flooding in parts of our area. A friend and fellow town council member, Todd Carter, then shared my post publicly on Facebook at 5:58, also on the 26th, encouraging people to take heed, which triggered a rehash of the same 2018 tropes critical of my talks. My favorite one, which, weirdly, came from someone who describes himself as a published historian, asked the same question I heard in 2018. Wait, a historian is predicting the weather? This person went on to insist that they trust Ray's weather, not me, and that historians are not climatologists. This person's rant went on for many double and tripled down comments, with others on the thread gently trying to explain to this person that studying things in context is actually what historians do for a living. Let me be clear. I take absolutely no pleasure in saying I told you so, especially about a tragic event that has devastated many thousands of lives in Boone, the High Country, and Western North Carolina. And that's not my point here. What I'm trying to emphasize is that the job of the skilled historian is to understand the past better than our peers, and to help contextualize that past so that the rest of us can learn from it in the present and the future. With this in mind, my task here today is to revisit some of what I said in 2018 about patterns, causes, and effects, then contextualize it further with the additional data points associated with Helene. My hope is that we can reconsider our options and take action that will reduce the impacts the next time around. And yes, there will be a next time around. As human beings, we are wired to forget trauma. So it's completely understandable to me that Boone's collective historical memory tends to focus on the really bad floods over the years, usually the most recent one, and ignore the others. When the 1940 flood happened, some folks remembered 1902 and 1916, but 1940 dwarfed those impacts and made them more easily forgettable. For me, January 2013 was my traumatic Helene precursor. My wife Teresa and I moved to Boone in 2011, unaware when we first got here of the flooding risks in these mountains. And then January 30, 2013 happened. My wife and I lived on Rocky Creek Road then, just off Winkler's Creek Road and along the lower reaches of Flannery Fork, a gentle, meandering, shallow stream that flows along Rocky Creek Road for much of its length. Our daily walks back then went from our house out a mile along the creek to the end of the road and then back again. That January, Teresa was working in the mass store in Boone. It rained very heavily for much of the afternoon, and at about 5 o'clock, when she had not been released from work, and as the merging waters of Flannery Fork and Winkler's Creek, which is usually 12 feet below the roadway, was actually lapping at the bottom of the bridge, I called her and said, "I'm coming to get you while I still can." Floodwaters blocked the intersection of 321 and 105, so I backtracked to Faculty Street, only to find that blocked by floodwaters at Highland Avenue. Ultimately, my only viable route into town was via Poplar Grove Road, and that was dicey to say the least. When we got back to Winkler's Creek Road, a massive landslide blocked the entire road near our turnoff for Rocky Creek. We had to drive through some poor soul's front yard to get home. We lived just a few houses in, and we were lucky. For my neighbors further out Rocky Creek Road, many of them would remain stranded literally for weeks. Their bridges and the road itself completely carried away by the flooding, scraped down to the bedrock. I never thought I'd see something like that again while living in Boone. But the details of the January 2013 event elsewhere in town will probably sound familiar. As a result of the flood, numerous residents were evacuated because of a propane leak at Suburban Propane, which, if you don't know, is located squarely in the middle of the active floodway, not a flood zone. It is in the floodway in Boone. 23 apartments along Meadowview Drive were condemned. The Boone Fire Department responded to 19 swift water rescue calls. Watauga County Maintenance Engineer Kevin Whittington called it the worst flooding he had seen since Hurricane Ivan in 2004, just 9 years earlier, and apparently Mr. Whittington's traumatic precursor event for 2013. That 2013 event changed my perspective on Watauga County's history of floods. Local authorities called the 2013 flood a 500-year event, but I soon learned that there had been something much worse in 1940 and a similar event in 1916. Based just on what I knew then, that meant at least 3 500-year events in the span of 100 years. And then the questions started to flow for me. What other significant floods have occurred in Watauga County? Where was the damage concentrated? Why were these floods so catastrophic? What factors contributed to these events? And of course, that most important of historical questions, what can we learn from these events? Before we get into that, we need to get some misleading terminology out of the way involving milestone events. There is the 1,000-year event. Hurricane Helene, 1940 flood probably qualify as 1,000-year events. These events have a 0.1% chance of occurring in any given year. So when we say, and this is sort of a simplistic way that people talk about this, a FEMA person, if they were here in the room, would say, stop using these terms, they don't mean anything. But we sort of take the math and convert it to help ourselves understand. So when we say a 1,000-year event, that doesn't mean, oh, we've had ours, we're done, we're good for many, many lifetimes, we never have to worry about it again. It means just based on the historical record, one would think that there is a 0.1% chance of it occurring in any given location in that region. Similar situation with a 500-year event, the 1902, 1916 events in Boone, both qualified as 500-year events. Hurricane Hugo in 1989, the combined impacts of Francis and Ivan in 2004, the January 2013 event I've already described, October 2017, which we're going to discuss in a moment. All those events had a 0.2% chance of happening in any given year. And then we have many 100-year events in this area. Too many for me to list here, I'd be here all night. But noteworthy ones include April 1957, August of 73, November of 77, February of 83, September of 2011, May of 2013, July of 2013, May of 2018, etc. These events have a 1% chance of happening in any given year, and then yet you look at that and there are 4 of them just in the 2010s in the span of 7 years. So the math doesn't math, but these terms will be important when we discuss the FEMA flood maps in just a few minutes. To understand why Boone floods, though, we have to start with the factors that contribute in conjunction with one another to these flooding events. And one, of course, and I would say arguably is the most important factor, is topography. And when I say topography, I'm actually going to talk about several elements of why topography is important. This view that you see here shows the stream basins in and around Boone. They're highlighted in gray and blue because that's actually an overlay of the FEMA flood maps along those stream basins to help you understand. I'm going to give you another image in a moment that I think will amplify what I'm trying to get at here. By the way, just as an aside, the flood mapping that you see at this point is what's considered the current flood maps, which I think are 15 years old at this point. We're in the process of awaiting finalization of our next set. We will also discuss those a little bit further on. So what this shows is that Boone is pretty clearly in a geographical bowl. Our streams flowing into downtown Boone drain Howard's Knob and Rich Mountain to the north and west to form Boone Creek. Boone Creek then flows toward the southeast toward Boone Mall, where it meets Hodges Creek and Winkler's Creek. From there, the water flows to the northeast, where it meets the middle and east forks of the New River near the hospital, before making its way off toward the northeast. Unfortunately, the lowest portions of our odd-shaped bowl happen to lie where our most concentrated existing development is located. Why? Because flatter and more gentle topography makes it easier and less expensive to build. And for obvious reasons, we as humans also have a tendency to locate concentrations of settlement close to fresh water sources, particularly if we're interested in drilling for a well that can serve that house. Now, if you're on town water, that's less of an issue. But even where we are, Teresa and I and my brother, we all live kind of up Junaluska a bit, and there are lots above us that can never get town water because they're above the topmost water tower, so they have to drill a well. Weirdly, we also tend to place our roads in close proximity to these freshwater channels, particularly in the mountains, again because it's flatter and easier to build on. In the Piedmont, this makes some sense, but in the mountains, it's a bit more complicated, and choosing the easy way is often short-sighted. In other words, we've been doing it wrong for about 100 years, maybe a little bit longer. Human beings also tend to have a rather short-sighted thought process about changing their environment. This image from 1907 shows the fledgling App State campus in the foreground and the town of Boone in the distance at left. What should stand out to you from this image is Rich Mountain and part of Howard's Knob visible in the background, and if you squint really well, you might be able to notice that there are hardly any trees on the Junaluska hillside. It's almost entirely clear-cut. Clear-cutting practices in the early 20th century wreaked havoc on the stability of our mountain soils and amplified runoff, since there were fewer trees and plant materials to stabilize those soils and soak up moisture. That means the water from heavy rain would rush downhill more quickly, inundating areas at lower elevations. What we do at the bottom of the bowl also matters. This image shows the Blowing Rock Road corridor from downtown to the Boone Mall as it appeared in 2010. Running sort of diagonally through the center, you'll notice the overlay of our current flood map, which was active in 2010, running along Boone Creek. That wide swath of flood zone running parallel to Blowing Rock Road between the Convocation Center and the Boone Mall. Nearly every inch of that flood zone was paved over and developed in 2010, with Boone Creek forced into underground culverts below the developments. Not surprisingly, culverts that were not designed to carry the volumes of excess rain events that we have frequently fail or overflow, forcing that water to the surface. If you lived here before 2015, you know that the old hotel parking lots along that stretch flooded frequently. And in one event in 2010, a young boy playing in the floodwaters in basically the parking lot of one of those hotels was sucked into a culvert and drowned. By 2015, much of that property had been converted into the Standard, a massive student housing complex on the site. There's not much that I have to praise about the Standard, except for one thing. The town insisted that the developers daylight Boone Creek through that property, and the developers agreed. Daylighting that creek and replanting the area around the creek has made a huge improvement, actually, in how this stretch of Boone Creek performs when we have smaller scale flooding events. And there's a lesson there that we can apply elsewhere in town in our other areas that are covered over and culverted. Topography is also not our friend when it comes to heavy precipitation. Low pressure systems in the northern hemisphere have a rotation that is counterclockwise. Along the east coast of the US, what this means is that any significant low pressure system, whether it's a full-fledged hurricane, a wintry nor'easter, or a tropical remnant, pulls in moisture from the east, in other words, the Atlantic Ocean, and pushes it to the northwest, up against the higher elevations of the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Western Escarpment. This map shows the path of the eye of the unnamed hurricane in August 1940 that ultimately led to the 1940 flood. That storm moved inland on August 11 near Beaufort, South Carolina, passed through Georgia and eastern Tennessee on August 12, then parked itself over the Appalachian Mountains on August 13, and stayed for a few days before heading east toward Norfolk on August 17. While the eye actually passed just to the east of Watauga County late on August 14, a meteorological phenomenon known as orographic lifting caused moisture in the northeast quadrant of the storm on August 13 to be wrung out of the atmosphere as it rotated to the west and northwest up against the higher terrain of the mountains. This is when the heaviest rainfall and flooding occurred in Watauga County. Nearly 4 inches of rain fell before the afternoon measurement on August 13, and another 5 inches fell that night. While the meteorological setup and path of Helene was entirely different from the 1940 storm, the general principle is similar. The low just to our west, and easterly winds pushing a steady stream of moisture up against the higher topography of the mountains. The same principle explains why Ray's weather expressed the most concern about the potential effects of Helene on the eastern slopes of the Blue Ridge, where the effects of orographic lifting usually tend to be the worst. You can see here just in Weather's morning surface update from September 27, 2024, when Helene's eye was still in Georgia. The stalled frontal boundary, which you can see snaking up from Georgia, kind of around us, and then leading out into the Atlantic from New York, is the same frontal boundary that during the preceding 2 days had dropped all of that pre-Helene rain on us. It was stranded almost over top of us during those first 2 days before Helene was here. Helene basically rode that frontal boundary just to our west, as low pressure systems do, and Helene's circulation pushed a lot of Atlantic moisture up against our mountains. This map here projects Helene going further west than it actually did, so the concentration of heaviest rain was actually just to our southwest, not back in Tennessee. Again, that term, orographic lifting, amplified these outcomes. These are actually common setups for flooding in our area, even if the system is not tropical. A stalled frontal boundary, a low pressure system riding that boundary, and a fire hose of moisture coming in off the Atlantic, then being wrung out by orographic lifting. Now, it's a lot of meteorology, and I promised that I would actually do some history here tonight, so I would like to do a quick review of the major and most serious flooding events in Watauga's history prior to Helene to help contextualize our discussion later. The first of these series events documented by the Watauga Democrat was on February 28, 1902, and it pretty much wrecked the thinly settled backwater county seat then known as Boone. On March 6, 1902, Robert C. Rivers wrote in the Democrat, Perhaps not in a generation has there been a rain that caused such widespread devastation and ruin in Watauga as that which fell last Thursday night. The rain began to fall late in the evening, developing into a perfect tornado during the night, but the fury of the storm had almost abated by midnight. In those few hours, the little streams about the village, and in fact all over the county, were changed from dancing rivulets into roaring and foaming cataracts, carrying fences, bridges, etc. before them, and literally sweeping the soil from much of our rich mountain lands. This view in this image shows King Street looking to the west. At left is the Watauga Democrats building at that time, located on the same site as the later iteration of the Democrat, and presently known as South End Brewing. The 1875 courthouse at North Water and King is visible a bit further in the distance. Speaking of the stream coming down from Junaluska on North Water Street, which was then daylighted, not diverted into a culvert, Rivers added, quote, "The little stream that runs by the courthouse carried hundreds of rails, logs, and other debris from Howard's Knob, drifting them in the street, causing the stream to leave its bed and form into a perfect lake in front of the Democrat office. In fact, before it gained an outlet, the water rose to such a height that it only lacked a few inches of getting up to the office windows." Rivers' account is telling in that he speaks of the logs coming all the way down from Howard's Knob. This would have been the leftover debris from heavy logging operations on the clear-cut hillside, and the visible boulders and mud in the foreground of this image tell the rest of the tale. Without anything to anchor the soil or absorb and thus retain the moisture, much of that land and debris gave way and traveled into town. This view looks east along King Street. The Watauga Democrat is at right, with the Blair Hotel in the distance at right, and the J.D. Crack Council, where the post office now sits, at left. It was only 14 years after the 1902 flood when the local community was dealing with another 500-year event. As a result of heavy rainfall that fell over 2 days in mid-July 1916, county residents experienced a litany of destruction that sounds awfully familiar when compared with what we saw in 1940 and with Helene. While Cove Creek, Valley Cruces, and Shulls Mill saw heavy damage to commercial businesses, agriculture, and infrastructure, by comparison, the 1916 flood's effects in Boone proper were relatively tame. Most damage was actually just outside of town. All but 2 bridges on the turnpike from Boone to Blowing Rock were carried away, leaving that road impassable for weeks. Perhaps most devastating was the collapse of the Trout Lake Dam at the Cone Estate, sending waters rushing through Flannery Fork to its junction with Winkler's Creek, destroying numerous homes and stripping the agricultural fields further down to the bedrock. This cascade took out Winkler's mill buildings and ultimately found itself pushing through the lowlands owned by Winklers, Farthings, Edmistons, Blairs, and others. In case those names and those lands are not familiar to you, I'll make it clear. Boone Mall, Lowe's Hardware, Walmart, Boone Heights, the Recreation Center, Optimist Park, the Boone Golf Course, the Greenway, and every single business and apartment complex lying today adjacent to those areas and in the path. The New River Light and Power Dam, located at that time where the powerhouse ruins are on the Greenway, remained partially intact but was detached from the shore at both ends, causing the village of Boone to be without power for more than 2 weeks. Most of the farmers along this long run of Flannery Fork, Winkler's Creek, and the South Fork of the New River suffered nearly total losses in their agricultural bottomlands. In less than 40 years, longtime Boone locals would forget that history, though, and began rapidly developing the Blowing Rock Road and Meadowview Drive corridors with motels, a drive-in cinema, restaurants, and yes, homes. Just 24 years later, in August 1940, Boone and Watauga County were once again facing a large-scale flooding event, definitely of the 500-year variety and arguably more in line with a 1,000-year event on par with Helene. As I described earlier, its effects were the result of the remnants of an unnamed hurricane moving inland and meandering about Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina for days on end, and dropping a deluge on Watauga County. All told, the rainfall in eastern Watauga County totaled between 10 and 14 inches, the vast majority of it falling on August 13. For a comparison of this event to the 1916 flood, the Watauga River at Sugar Grove reached a maximum flood stage of 22.1 feet in 1916. Maximum flood stage at the same location in 1940 was an absurd 29.6 feet around 7 p.m. on the night of August 13th. For comparison, floodwaters at the same location peaked at 29.5 feet during Helene, basically equal to what we saw in 1940. The resulting damage in 1940 was severe throughout the area. Many main roads also suffered severe damage, leaving residents in many parts of the county stranded for weeks. Engineering News Record reported on August 22 that highway officials had estimated that 90% of the secondary road bridges in Ashe, Wilkes, and Watauga counties have been destroyed. One of the great casualties of the flood was the Linville River Railway between Cranberry and Boone, whose tracks and trestles were decimated by landslides and flooding. While the railroad had never really been profitable and was more vital for freight traffic than its passenger loads, the East Tennessee and Western North Carolina Railroad decided not to reopen the line after the 1940 flood. That was the end of train service to Boone. But while flooding and the loss of transportation infrastructure were disabling for the Watauga community, the real terror was the loss of life from the landslides that accompanied the 1940 flood. Now remember, many of the hillsides have still not recovered from all of that logging. Many of them are bare. More than 2,000 documented landslides occurred in Watauga County alone in 1940, 763 of them in the Deep Gap and Stony Fork areas. Shown here is the landslide in the Stony Fork area that destroyed the Watson filling station and the Guy Carlton filling station on the North Wilkesboro Highway, just east of where the Blue Ridge Parkway crosses 421. Every time you are driving east toward Wilkesboro, you pass over the path of this landslide. Killed in this landslide were Martha Ann Carroll and Johnny Green. Iona Miller Bumgardner, who lived downhill from the gas stations, was also killed, although her body has never been found. According to contemporary newspaper accounts, this one landslide traveled more than 2 miles before leveling off and amplifying the stream flooding at Stony Fork. All told, 16 people were killed in Watauga, 32 homes were completely destroyed, and many, many more homes and businesses flooded. Farm losses were well into the millions of dollars in 1940 dollars. Boone had its own fair share of damage from the flood, especially hard hit were North Water Street and King Street. If you were in Boone for Helene, you're going to probably wonder, am I looking at an image from Helene? Because this exact same thing happened in Helene. Seen here is the intersection of Depot and King, looking west from the second floor of the W.R. Winkler building. If you go online, you can actually find images from the webcam that is in that exact same position on that building now that show what it looked like during Helene. At the south end of Depot Street, the bridge over Boone Creek was washed out, leaving the depot isolated from the rest of town. On North Water Street, near the 1875 courthouse and the 1939 Watauga County office building, the culvert handling water coming down the hill from Junaluska completely clogged with debris and failed, causing water to flood across the surface instead, peeling back the asphalt on North Water Street and inundating several vehicles there. That water flowing down North Water Street ultimately met with the water flowing downhill to the east on King Street, creating a turbulent scene of turgid water and debris in the midst of the flooding. At one point, the water was so deep that fish from AE South's stocked fish pond at the head of North Water Street, where Bill Dixon lives today, if you know Bill, that stock pond had been blown out by the Junaluska torrent, and the fish from that pond were actually captured by a local resident in the front of the Sinclair service station, about where the Boone Fire Department is now, and visible just to the right in the center of this image. Most of the businesses on the south side of King Street, from the Watauga Democrat building to the Belk department store, which is now the antique store opposite Mast, had flooded interiors. Many of the business owners in these locations would have that same experience during Helene. According to reports in the Watauga Democrat, all main roads out of Boone were impassable for nearly a week, with 421 from Boone to North Wilkesboro closed for more than a month. In the span of just 8 miles along 421 in Watauga and Wilkes counties, the highway was severed and completely impassable at 21 different places. Since the 1940 flood, heavy rains have occasionally ravaged parts of Watauga County and with increasing frequency. A deluge in December 1950, which the Watauga Democrat described as the heaviest since 1940, flooded basements in Boone, sent streams out of their banks, and left cattle marooned on high spots in lowland fields. In April 1957, a 100-year event produced 5 inches of rain, causing the dam at Mystery Hill Lake to burst. Probably didn't even know there was a lake at one time at Mystery Hill, with roads and highways heavily damaged and lowland farm crops washed away. Landslides blocked the new Linville Highway, better known to us today as NC 105, and several bridges throughout the county were washed away or knocked out of place. Other events in December of 59, August of 61, March of 63, August of 73, November of 77, and February of 83 followed heavy rainfalls between 3 and 6 inches, damaging homes, destroying some, taking out bridges, and endangering lives. Once the Boone Mall was built in the early 1980s, it became a common locus for flooding along with the Boondocks area, seen in this flooding image from circa 1990. For 40 years, locals in Boone have known that this area is basically a boat rescue just waiting to take place. I already told you about our experience in January of 2013 and how I thought I'd never see anything like that again, and yet not even 6 months later, here we were, living close to downtown and dealing with this. This July 2013 storm resulted in a FEMA disaster declaration for Watauga County. Based on this image taken at the intersection of Holmes Drive and Blowing Rock Road, that's the old Hardee's at the right, currently being worked on for a new bar. Flooding along Blowing Rock Road reached the outer limit of the 500-year flood zone. Flooding has reached this same outer limit at least 3 times since the construction of the standard in 2015, when the daylighting of the stream actually helped with flooding in this area. 2 of those occasions were October 2017 and, of course, Helene last year. You may remember the 2017 event if you've been up in this area for a bit. This is a view of the flooding at the Boone Mall on October 23, 2017. This was routinely referred to at the time as an historic flooding event that saw not only the usual locations like the Boone Mall parking lot flood, but also locations that aren't even labeled on our flood maps as being within the 500-year flood zone. More than 40 apartment units and dozens of homes and businesses were flooded as a result of the heavy rains. Governor Cooper requested an SBA disaster declaration for Watauga County in the wake of this flood. The Boone Weather Station registered a total of just 6.75 inches of rain in the 2 days leading up to this flooding, about half of what fell in 1940 and only a third of what fell during Helene. This is what King Street looked on May 18, 2018, when the North Water Street culvert handling all of the flow from the 4 branches on Junaluska Hill became clogged. As I drove past the Appalachian Management Building that day during the heavy rain, the culvert drain adjacent to their building was spewing a geyser 40 feet into the air. That issue was caused by a larger culvert, a town-maintained culvert, coming down from Junaluska and meeting the smaller diameter culvert maintained by NCDOT at that location where the drain is. Lots of water doesn't like to go in a smaller hole when it's been in a bigger hole, and so that's why we got a geyser. To date, NCDOT, despite repeated requests from the town, has refused to address this issue. As you may remember, North Water Street from that event was closed for the better part of 2 weeks as the town repaired its culvert, which was ultimately damaged because of that backup happening in their line. According to NOAA, Boone's weather gauge registered just over 6 inches of rain during the 4 days leading up to this culvert failure. About half of that on May 18. The 6-inch total, again, is about half of the amount in 1940, about a third of the amount in Helene. In response, Governor Roy Cooper announced that he was applying for FEMA funding again to assist Watauga County. Teresa and I were fortunate with Helene. I spent part of that Friday trying to help our neighbors up the street keep a huge mud flow from entering their home. But other than losing power and water for a few days, ruining 2 pairs of shoes and a set of clothes, having to throw away a small amount of damaged personal property, and seeing the road by our house disappear into the creek, we fared pretty well. Our friends Odina, Emma, Nora, and Garrett did not. Three of them lived in this house. 3 of them lived at this house on the corner of Meadowview and Leola near Walmart, and across the street from the old trailer park. Garrett spent the night there on the 26th, fearful about trying to make it home to his place in meat camp, and had his car with his computer and all of his belongings on the site, parked behind the house. The water rose to nearly 3 feet high inside the house. They were initially boat rescued, then tried to go home and clean up after the waters receded. When Teresa and I got to them on the 28th, their house reeked of raw sewage, kerosene from toppled tanks, mold, and something else that reminded me, frankly, of death. We pleaded with them to come to our house for as long as it took, and they did so for about 3 weeks. It brought us closer, and Teresa and I have felt a little like proud parents to see them rebuild their lives. But in that moment, they had lost almost everything. That house is no longer there, one of roughly 200 housing units in Boone that were condemned, many of which were later demolished. What angers me most about their experience is that my friends did not know the risks of living there. Their lease apparently did not contain the notification addendum required by town code, and they hadn't lived here long enough to know that the house was in an area that floods regularly. They are not the exception. In the aftermath, as we met with people who lived in that area, tried to inform them of what their rights were because there were landlords who were trying to keep them in condemned dwellings, we learned that many of the residents of this area had no idea of the risks they were facing by living there, and most of them lost everything. So I've already talked about how topography, perhaps more than anything else, is not our friend here in Watauga County for several reasons. But beyond that topography, there are also several risk factors in our area that make it more likely that we will have trouble from heavy rain events. Of the 3 factors, 2 of these factors we can do nothing about, other than to adjust our decision-making to account for them. The first risk factor is the nature of our soils in Watauga County, particularly on our steep slopes. As this chart indicates, the brighter red is steeper slope and more dangerous slope. We live in an area marked by high debris flow incidence and susceptibility. In short, our topography has already betrayed us, and the danger lies hidden beneath our feet and our homes. As the researchers behind this chart explained in 2009, the key conditions necessary for debris flows to be triggered are excessive rainfall, elevated terrain with steep slopes, and a susceptible supply of material, which essentially means dirt or colluvium that likes to slide across the underlying bedrock. Our soils are prone to all 3 conditions here in Watauga. The second factor is that as our climate warms globally and locally, we increase the frequency of large-scale rain events. This happens as NASA's Global Precipitation Measurement mission explained before January 2025, when all this stuff basically went offline, that because, quote, rising temperatures intensify the Earth's water cycle, increased evaporation results in more frequent and intense storms. As a result, storm-affected areas are likely to experience increases in precipitation and increased risk of flooding. Historical figures from the 2017 Climate Science Special Report produced by the US and mandated by Congress in 1990 highlight the second risk factor, increasing rainfall intensity over the past 125 years that has actually accelerated even more in the past 70 years. These charts show that we're seeing dramatic increases in extreme precipitation events over the past century. In particular, our region has seen a 27% increase in daily events that exceed the 99th percentile of all rainfall events for the historic period from 1958 to 2016. And we've seen a 58% increase in our region in the number of 2-day precipitation events that exceed the largest 2-day amount that is expected to occur within a 5-year period for the past century, and a 49% increase in such events for the past 70 years. On a local level, there is little we can do about this, but we need to be aware of these issues, and we need to prepare for the consequences. So if building in the flood zones is a bad idea, then you might wonder if building on ridge tops or mountainsides is a better solution. What we've known since that 1902 event here in Boone, though, is that deforesting our ridge tops and mountainsides only amplifies the speed and intensity of downhill water flow in heavy rain events. Putting more impermeable surface on those ridge tops and mountainsides only makes it worse. In May 2018, Ellicott City, Maryland learned the importance of these factors the hard way. Like Boone, their historic town is located in a bowl fed by several streams flowing down into a valley. Upstream on the hilltops, new developments continue to be built, in spite of a flood event in 2016 that devastated the town. When 8 inches of rain fell quickly on the area in the span of 2 hours in 2018, a similar volume of water to what fell in 2016, and thus the second 1,000-year flooding event in just 2 years, areas not affected in 2016, this time around, were completely inundated. Local officials now widely acknowledge the role that intensified development and stormwater runoff played in the 2018 catastrophe. As estimated in 2016, fixing the problem would cost Ellicott City $35 million in immediate improvements and another $85 million in long-term projects for a revamped stormwater management system, with little of it implemented before the 2018 event. By 2022, that $85 million had doubled when they announced plans for a 5,000-foot-long underground tunnel to carry away water flow during extreme events. It would cost $167 million to help redirect floodwaters. As of 2025, none of it has been built. That just shows, again, how this is a race against time. And then we have our flood maps. Frankly, what I'm about to say is very much what I said in 2018. It's been 7 years since those talks, and my 2 years so far on Boone's Town Council helped me better understand how challenging implementation of the necessary solutions is. Our problems begin on the sides of our bowl and amplify with our insistence on cramming more and more people and their housing inside the bowl. We've talked already about the culverts leading into downtown Boone, one of which is responsible for the vast majority of the water streaming off of the Junaluska hillside. When we bury our streams in a tube, all of the debris they carry eventually builds up in those tubes. And when we have extreme weather events, sometimes those tubes clog or fail altogether, as happened with the event that I described in May of 2018. But we have other issues in downtown Boone, closer to the bottom of the bowl, where this is an issue too. In this section that I show you here, this is the long stretch from the former Goodnight Brothers property in downtown Boone to ASU's Varsity Gym, which lies entirely underground in culverts. It is not a coincidence that this is also the source of some of the worst flooding in the downtown ASU area when we have extreme weather events. It's worth a reminder that diverted water from this culvert nearly caused the Fairfield Apartments to collapse into the Peacock lot in 2011. Daylighting Boone Creek along the stretch would have the benefit of slowing down the flow of water as it passes through this vicinity, while also helping to control flooding within this stretch of Boone Creek. This in turn has benefits for folks who are further downstream too. Other options for daylighting include the area between the Convocation Center and NC 105 along Faculty Street, where clogged and failing culverts coupled with sinkholes can continue to be an issue. The town and ASU have had regular discussions since 2018 about the possibility of daylighting Boone Creek through the Peacock lot on River Street. As of this fall, that project remains stalled and unfunded by the state legislature. This is the Blowing Rock corridor today with the existing flood zones overlaid. And by that I mean the old flood maps overlaid on here. Light blue is the 100-year flood zone, dark blue is the 500-year zone. If there's one common factor about the land in the bottom of our bowl today, it's the impermeable surface parking lots that run on forever, as far as the eye can see, punctuated by impermeable rooftops on the buildings sitting in the middle of those parking lots. As this view of the flood zones around the Boone Mall shows, the vast majority of the land area around the streams is paved, which means no rainfall that falls in this area is retained through saturation of soils. It all runs off. This amplifies the effects of heavy rainfall not only in the immediate area, but also for those lying downstream. In the Walmart and Boone Heights areas, the situation is even more frightening, with nary a green space or retention swale to be found, aside from the Greenway Trail located in the midst of the flood channel. In short, as long as runoff from our higher elevations is not captured and retained before it hits the streams of the valley floor, and as long as our valley floor remains a giant parking lot with buried culverts incapable of handling that runoff, then the water will have nowhere to go but up and out into our businesses and our homes. FEMA knows this, and I am normally a big proponent of the good that FEMA can do. But one of their failings is the way the flood map program works. As I mentioned, ours are at least 15, almost 20 years old. They began the process of renewals and notified us, if I recall correctly, it was the week before Helene, hey, we've got your new flood maps. Your 20-year renewal time is coming next month, so you can take a look at them. This is the Blowing Rock road corridor with the recently proposed FEMA flood maps overlaid. The hashed area is the floodway, dark blue is the 100-year flood zone, yellow is the 500-year zone. The data used to create these maps preceded entirely Helene, and despite our requests, they would not modify the maps to reflect data from Helene. Some notable things stand out though. First, throughout the Boone area, many areas throughout town have seen modest reductions in their 100 and 500-year flood zone coverage. To me, the most galling change on this part of the map is that Boone Heights Drive and the stores on the east side of the road by Winkler's Creek have been removed from the 500-year flood zone, even though all of those businesses flooded and several were condemned for months. Portions of the area along Furman Drive and in the Wellness District, including my dentist's office, which flooded and was closed for more than 6 months, have been removed from the 100-year flood zone. There was a public comment period on September 30, 2025. I'm hopeful that some of you here were able to attend, and I'm hopeful that some of the changes that were put forward then will be made. But there are other opportunities. Our local officials have discussed solutions for years. Following the 2013 floods, the Boone Town Council authorized the formation of a stormwater management task force, but by 2017 that task force still had not been formed. In June 2018, Town Council approved funding for a flood study, part of which would be funded by federal grant funds. That study came out in 2021, called the Stormwater and Stream Enhancement Plan for Winkler, Hodges, and Boone Creeks, and it was presented to Town Council. That same year, the town hired George Santucci, the Sustainability and Special Projects Manager, as well as Brandon Weiss, who is now Boone's Deputy Director of Planning. He started out as the Planning Department's environmental specialist and continues in that role today. Together, they have worked intensely on mitigating our flooding concerns throughout town. Most recently, stream restoration at Lower Hardin Creek helped to stabilize the stream bed and protect nearby sewer mains that are in the floodway and the Greenway Trail. Future projects aim to address other areas along Winkler Creek that are high priority sections of concern. These projects often depend on grant funding. Cuts to these programs that fund this kind of work by the Trump administration do not bode well for us seeing any of these projects completed in the near term. Since 2018, Council has also recommended consideration of a municipal service district in the Blowing Rock Road corridor that would be designed specifically to fund stormwater management improvements. It would function much like the MSD in downtown Boone. This is an idea that was resurrected by Boone councilman and current mayoral candidate Dalton George in 2004, about a month before Helene. While the effects of Helene unfortunately required that we briefly table that item until Helene recovery was mostly complete, since it felt weird to say to Blowing Rock businesses, hey, I know you just flooded, we're going to add a tax on you while you're trying to recover. We decided to table that, and we are going to take it up again in 2026. These are all good first steps, but I fear that we underestimate the amount of investment required to prevent a catastrophe like the one that occurred at Ellicott City, Maryland. Remember, we have had numerous significant flooding events in the past 15 years, 4 of which have resulted in requests for federal disaster aid from our governor. Those pre-Helene events were the canaries in the coal mine. Helene made it clear that we can't wait anymore. Nothing short of a comprehensive plan with a long view towards sustained investment and consideration of our streambeds and creeks as a system rather than distinct components will allow us to prepare for the next such event. Other communities in Watauga that are often hard hit by flooding, like Valley Crucis and Sugar Grove, should make similar plans through the county officials. Those plans will also mean making difficult choices about how we use the floodlands we already live and work on. This is a shot from 2017 of the entrance to the Boone Mall, and it's hard to see, but there's a sign up that says, due to flooding, use the rear entrance. It's absurd that a property owner has invested in pre-printed signs to alert people to use the other entrance to avoid the floodwaters, then places these signs in the parking lot at least once a year. It's absurd that every time that property and that property and the properties in the Boondocks area flood, our emergency resources are spent rescuing someone from their car who didn't know, as most longtime locals do, that it's not smart to park on this side of the mall when it's raining. It's absurd that we collectively see our auto insurance rates in Boone climb dramatically just because parking here in the rain is still a thing. It's even more absurd that a large apartment complex is located in a flood zone, and I'm looking at you, Meadowview Drive. A large apartment complex is located in a flood zone just yards from a propane tank dealer located in the actual flood channel, both of which have been there for more than 30 years. Or that we've knowingly permitted other apartment complexes and businesses to be built in flood zones, gambling that the next 100-year, 500-year, or 1,000-year flood event really won't happen for another 100 years, or 500 years, or 1,000 years. All that, even though we've had at least a dozen such events in the last 15 years. What it will take is businesses, local nonprofits, local government, county, and town, ASU, and private property owners coming together to find solutions. The wake of Helene left us with a Western North Carolina Recovery Committee. I'm on it, and it continues to meet monthly and counts among its members many people from the above stakeholder groups. As we move out of the recovery stage from Helene and begin to think again about prevention and long-term planning, it's essential that those stakeholders stay focused on the long term, continue to meet and talk to one another about how they can work together so that we can address the recurring threat that these severe rain and flooding events pose for our communities now and in the long-term future. This aerial image from 1950, showing the terrain along Blown Rock Road from where Walmart stands today at upper left to where the Standard begins at lower right, encapsulates nicely how much our landscape changed since the floods of 1916 and 1940. I understand how some might think that I'm opposed to new development in Boone based on what I've said here, but I'm not. Our community will continue to grow, and we will still need to provide housing and business areas for that population. But what I'm calling for is smart development, an investment in our community by public and private forces together to correct decades of foolish, short-sighted land management decisions that continue to endanger our lives, our property, and the welfare of our community, often decades after those decisions were made. In making those corrections, we should be mindful of the words of Andrew Jackson Green about our place in the world. The night after the 1940 flood, his heart heavy and his soul ill at ease, he recorded the following in his diary, quote, "Man is helpless in the face of nature. With all his boasting, his strength is insignificant compared to that of the elements," close quote. When the 1940 the flood struck, it was unlike anything that any lifelong Watauga resident had ever seen in his or her lifetime. Quote, "The flood came like a thief in the night," Mrs. Ivory Green wrote in 1941 about the storm. "Suddenly, unexpected by everyone." She might as well have been talking about Helene 85 years in the future. Today, another 1940, where Helene could strike at any time. Our local history of flooding from the past century and the past decade and the past year, coupled with the consequences of our continuing land management practices, warns us that the next devastating flood can no longer be considered unexpected. Thank you.